Chair.
Anyway. Great. Thank you. Welcome, folks. This is October 24th. This is a joint committee meeting of the House Corrections and Institutions Committee, as well as the Senate Institutions Committee. Senator Ingalls and myself will be chairing this joint committee. We've got a lot of information that's going to be presented to us. And I want to make sure that every member has a chance to ask questions that need to be asked. And the reason that we're having a joint meeting today, ahead of the legislative session, is to bring everyone here up to speed in terms of what has occurred in our Capitol complex due to the flooding back in July. Senator Ingalls and myself, and I know some members here in the took a tour of the buildings and the damage. I know some leadership, folks in the leadership position have also taken a tour. And the reason for the meeting today is just that for everyone just to get some background information to set the stage for our work in January. A few of us were here when Irene hit the state. I think there is only two of us left that were in the building. I think you weren't in the building.
Not yet. No.
There's only two of us sitting around the table here that were legislators when Irene hit the state. In terms of the institutions committees, there's Senator Mazza, who is still on the committee, that was here when we rebuilt the Waterbury Complex and the State Hospital, and myself, the Institutions Committee. So there's going to be a lot of layers to bringing our Capitol complex back. And it might impact our Capitol bill, and it might not. But the thinking is to get the foundation for you folks in terms of what the damage is, what has been repaired, how it can be repaired, and maybe there's some situations where the repairs may not be possible, where the repairs are possible, but there's a tremendous price tag. And we also have to be cognizant of how the insurance is going to play into this and how FEMA is going to play into this. Due to back experience that some of us, Mary was not on the committee. Mary Morrissey was not on the committee with Irene, but has experience in terms of some of the steps that occurred. There could be in one building, there could be 5 different projects in one building, but each of those projects has a project number or a project sheet that FEMA has to approve. And depending on that project, one project in a building could be a 10% state match. Another project in that same building could be a 25% state match. We just don't know. And we're not going to know for a while. And then the question becomes, is it money out of the capital bill? Is there other monies in the general fund? So we don't know how this is going to play out. But we both wanted, Senator Ingalls and myself both wanted to give our committees a chance to understand the damage that was done to the complex and understand the insurance piece and as much of the FEMA piece and how we can move forward with this and set us on a good foundation for when the session starts so that we have a better understanding when the governor proposes the capital bill budget adjustment, if there's any implications for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to thank the public who might be joining us and to echo Chair Emmons' comments and not to repeat them. There was a vast amount of damage that we're going to hear about today. I think that people look at government to solve problems. I know sometimes we have a reputation of getting in the way of problems, but I'm very proud of so far as the commitment that Chair Emmons and I have made to get ahead of this early and to bring the people who are going to be responsible for making sure that we repair the damage and probably make some decisions on how to make sure that it doesn't happen again. As far as looking at these buildings and to get them more flood resistant. So very happy that everybody's here, happy that the general public's here, happy that the folks from the administration are here, BGS and the support staff that are here. And I think we're going to have a very good day. And I would ask that if anybody's got any questions, that you ask them. One of the biggest things that was very, very important for Chair Emmons and myself is to see the damage and then to include folks in leadership so that they could actually see the damage as well. And so that if we were trying to talk about what we had seen and what the damage had been done, we didn't want to sensationalize it. We wanted to make it real. We wanted to make sure that people did understand the amount of damage that was there. And I think that so far we've done a great job. And I think this meeting today will set a good groundwork for the rest of you folks here on the committees and the public who may be watching. So thank you.
So let's start with the Commissioner of BGS and Joe Asia and their support staff. And I know that they have a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you. This is I assume you're going to put something up on the screen.
There you go.
Hopefully it works.
Hopefully it works.
Very large files today.
Yeah, Phil said it was a thumb drive. We need a thumb
Well, I thought
drive.
it was going to be a thumb drive.
Thumb drive was backup.
We have video clips and lots of photos, so those take up large file size.
And I would encourage as we go along to have questions as we go along. Does that work?
So while Joe gets that loaded up, for the record, my name is Jennifer Fitch, and I am the Commissioner of Buildings and General Services. I've worked for the state of Vermont since 2004, and I've been at BGS since 2007. And during that time, I've been through Tropical Storm Irene, a pandemic, and now the July flood. To start off, I just want folks to know that the men and women at BGS have been incredible this entire time. Operations and maintenance over the weekend preceding the July flooding event was here on site, sandbagging and doing all of those things that you do to prepare for a flood. In addition to that, our fleet team moved all the fleet vehicles out of the Capitol complex on the high ground National Life over the weekend as well. And so I just want to say thank you for all of their efforts. Unfortunately, the river rose higher than predicted. So it rose an additional 7 to 8 feet over where they thought it was going to rise on Sunday. So as we were sitting on the 5th floor of 133, which is the home to BGS central offices, we were actually there watching the river rise, both on the screen with the river gauge and in real time looking at the train bridge. And around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we recommended to the administration that we send people home, those that were left in the Capitol complex, because we were starting to get worried about the water coming up over the parking lots and into the roadway.
And that was Monday?
That was Monday, right around 2 o'clock. Then I actually live in Montpelier as well. And I went home and around 5 or 6 o'clock, I walked with my family downtown. And if you're familiar with where the roundabout is, it's kind of close to the middle school. It's at the end of Main Street. Water was already there by about 5:30 at night. And so that really speaks to how fast the flooding occurred here in the city of Montpelier. And then the following day, we had some folks like Joe who raced to get to work. I also want to say thank you to Janet Miller because she housed us for a week. As you know, most of the buildings, we'll talk about it today, were flooded, so we didn't have a place to set up. Janet Miller, Sergeant at Arms, took us in with open arms, allowed us to be here at the State House, which was very helpful, right, to be on the ground. And she also fed Joe breakfast. On Tuesday morning, so it's very, very sweet. And then the waters in the roadway did not recede. We couldn't walk across the street until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday. But for such a, what I would almost call a short storm, right? It came in within 24 hours, was completely devastated, and then receded back to the river again. So it certainly rose and dropped quickly, but during that time, obviously created a lot of devastation, not only for the state buildings in Montpelier, but obviously a lot of other folks, businesses downtown, who were devastated by the flooding event as well. So with that, we're going to give you a presentation and kind of walk through all of the buildings today. We have some good footage and some good photos to give you a sense of what it was like. I will tell you, I've never actually been on the ground that close to it before. And so it was very emotional, both for our buildings, but also for the downtown businesses as well. We worked very well with the city of Montpelier, hand in hand. We partnered a lot. Things like we helped get some of the debris out from under one of the bridges, for example, because there was a subsequent possible flooding event, those kinds of things. The city helped us by blocking off the roadway so that we could get a lot of work done. And so it was a great partnership with the city as well. I just want to thank them. Bill Frazier was fantastic. So with that.
Before we go too far, I know we have a lot of new members.
Sure.
To the legislature as a whole. Can you describe where the Capitol complex is so that members can visually know what we're talking about?
Absolutely.
What the Capitol
And
complex is.
we handed this sheet out, which will be helpful. That's actually a good segue to say, so our largest square footage of buildings is here in the Montpelier complex. It also houses the State House, the Supreme Court, and the Pavilion. So all three branches of government, basically their central offices are here in the complex. So as well as elected officials and other executive branch members. So it really speaks to the importance of this location and all of the folks that it supports in terms of supporting government operations. It is key. The good news here and the difference between Montpelier and Tropical Storm Irene and Waterbury is that through the pandemic, folks went remote. So the good news in our case was that people were easily able to go remote right after the event. Most people are still working remotely. Obviously, as we open buildings over time, people are coming back. Most people are continuing to work remotely. We did have to find very minor lease space, but we did it within our existing footprint. So that impact was much less here. And then in terms of the Montpelier complex, basically, we are from the Bailey Street Bridge, which I don't have orientation.
It's over here.
So it's over here. From the Bailey Street Bridge basically over to Taylor Street is basically the Capitol complex from the river all the way to basically behind the State House. And so there's an actual formal definition that lists all the roads, but that's basically where the Capitol complex is. And it's shown on this map that you have in front of you as well. And we'll use this today. A lot of people ask me either the building address or who is the tenant in the building. So having something like this makes it really easy. Lots of buildings.
Questions before we move on? Anything?
Good morning. For the record, Joe Ager with Buildington General Services. The site plan will come up later. So as the commissioner stated, we had a little flooding here in Montpelier. The rain started around July 9th and went through to a nice sunny day on July 11th. Warm and humid. During that time, Montpelier had a tremendous amount of water in the downtown area, including the state complex. In this cover picture here, and you're going to see more of a video that I'll show you that shows more of downtown Montpelier, you can see how much of the floodwaters had impacted the complex. And as you can see, really, on the State House lawn, you'll see a nice little line running across here. That's really where the floodwaters were at its peak. So when this photo was taken, it had receded at that point in time. So here's a nice little clip that we had on the backside of 122 State Street, which is the heat plant. We have a security camera out back, and this is a time-lapse video that we'll go through pretty quick because the whole duration of the floodwaters coming up over the bank and then receding again is approximately 25 hours. So when the river does start encroaching the height of the riverbank, it already impacts our basements. So we have a lot of stone foundation basements, and we do have some water infiltration at that point in time. So at the level you see here was already impacting some of our basements along the south side of State Street, and that's across from the State House. When it gets dark, you're going to see some flashing in the upper right background. Those are the fire alarm systems going off. You have a nice little floating sign, and then that'll disappear on us.
So that's by the heat plant, which is the tower that you see, the smokestack.
Correct.
That you see. And the heat plant is not impacted too much?
Not too much.
And we'll talk about why. That's important.
So it was about, the clip was roughly 4:30 a.m. until 5:30 p.m. on July, so the 10th to the 11th, that whole duration. So a lot of water impacted Montpelier. It hit 19 of BGS owned buildings.
In the
It impacted
complex.
it. Not all of them were flood waters. It was impacted mainly 2 and 4 Aiken was impacted because they're connected via both heat and electricity through 133 State Street. And so they lost power because of that.
Madam Chair, 13 Green Mountain Drive is the only one that's not inside the Capitol complex. And that is the Department of Liquor, their warehouse and their office building. So you'll see that as a little carve out on the bottom sheet there.
Right.
All the other buildings are inside the Montpelier Capitol complex.
This video here is going to show you a greater shot in and around Montpelier. And this was courtesy of the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Again, this is the same time frame. The water has receded at this point in time. You can see it running over the railroad trestle. So it was a lot higher. This was greater than the Irene flood. Montpelier did not flood much in Irene here in the downtown area. 92 flood, it was still greater than the 92 flood due to the ice storm. And this is my years of being here, living in Montpelier, working in Montpelier, I've never seen it this bad. It surrounded the high school down over off of Bailey Avenue.
Yeah, the flooding in 92 did not go out as much, correct?
It jumped the banks from the North Branch because of the ice dam in the Winooski, and then basically flowed onto Main Street and down State Street. But this impact that you see here, you know, the view looking south across the Montpelier High School, it's covering, on the right-hand side is Lower State Street. Right in the right center is the bridge, the Bailey Avenue Bridge. Upper left is the high school. Further to the left, you'll see Memorial Drive, and then Department of Labor building over here, 5 Green Mountain Drive. So, significant impact to downtown Montpelier. Oops. Come on, yeah, there we go. So our minimal damaged facilities or impacted facilities, 118 State Street. That is sort of set back behind 116,
This is
off of State Street.
Good time to start using your maps.
Behind the blue building, it's yellow, behind the blue building and to the right-hand side of 120 State Street. And that building had about 30 inches, 35 inches of water in the basement. And in that basement, we had a condensate pump and a water heater. Those are the only 2 items that were impacted. We were lucky. It came to the bottom of the electrical panel, did not impact it. So for some reason, that building did quite well. 120 and 122 State Street. When we added on to the heat plant at 122 State Street, we were required to comply with flood regulations at the time. That building's floor elevation is in the main part of the plant is above the 100-year flood elevation. The lower portion where the chips are stored and some of the processing takes place is below the base flood elevation. And we took on some water. We found some through coming in at the chip delivery system. We do have floodgates there, but due to the height of the water and the pressure, it was pushing in on those. We also had some leakage going in around some of the holes that we had plugged through the foundation, just because of the height of the water, the amount of pressure that was on there. So we had about 12 inches of water in the basement, partly due to the fact that our sump pumps had finally died due to chips and other debris getting into them. So that's sort of a lesson learned thing for us that, you know, even though we had sump pumps, they did come to the point of getting debris in there and that we'd have to, you know, do something about that in the future.
So we do have a question. Wayne?
Did we exceed the 100-year flood level? How much, if so, how much by?
In Montpelier, we're roughly at that level.
Roughly 100-year flood?
That is correct.
So we have another question.
Just to follow up, what is the 100-year flood elevation?
Depends where you are. How's that? Later on this afternoon, there is a slide that I can actually show you that. There are divisions 525, 524 is a rough elevation, USG elevation through this downtown Capitol complex area. 120 State Street, where DMV is located. That building took on also minimal water. We had done renovation to that building. We added exterior stair towers. elevator and a rear entrance, and also did some waterproofing on the building to comply with the FEMA regulations at the time. The only reason that we can find that we had leakage in that building is because there was a fitting on the sump pumps that had failed. And so it was just recirculating the water, but it had about 3 inches of water in the basement. So I think if that had not failed, we probably would not have had that much water in the basement at all. Again, 2 and 4 Aiken, as I said, lost power because the power feeds through 133 State Street. 6 Baldwin is connected via tunnel to 133 State Street. Thankfully, the elevator was up, and we did have some minor damage to the elevator at the base of the shaft that had to be repaired. We have grouped. I don't know. We had some gremlins. We have grouped this into basically 3 damaged areas besides no impact to the buildings or minimally impact. What you're going to see here now is that we have group 1, which is the south side of State Street that were impacted basement only. Group 2, south side of State Street that were impacted not only in the basement, but on the first floor. And then group 3 is the north side.
Group 3 is what?
North side of State Street.
And if you look at that last photo, that should look very familiar to many of you. That is the pavilion.
Pavilion Auditorium?
Oh my gosh.
We're looking at the photos here. The center photo is the auditor's building, 132 State Street. And the minimally impacted building, the first photo is 118 State Street. You can see the little water heater right in here. Here's the site plan that's laid out in front of you. Again, the grouping is no impact, green buildings, minimally impact, yellow. Group 1 is blue, basement only impact. Group 2 is sort of like brown, depends on what screen and or paper you're looking at. Orange, basement and first floor, and then the red is on the north side of State Street. So throughout all of our buildings that were hit in the complex and 13 Green Mountain Drive, there's a common theme of what was impacted. It's our electrical systems, electrical panels, switches, everything along those lines. Water heaters. A lot of these items are all located in the basement. Fire alarm panels, our access control system for our door system. All the pipe insulation was impacted and got wet. All of our condensate pumps, most of our buildings are on or fed steam. So at the lowest point, you have a condensate pump sending that condensate water back to the heat plant. And then our ADS's network switches. Other buildings, depends on which one you are, had other stuff in them. There was sort of some storage in a lot of these basements that were impacted, but this is the common theme running through all of them. Group 1, south side of State Street. And what I've shown here, and you'll see this theme running all the way through, is I'm providing you with a site plan, a floor plan of the building, showing you the impact of the basement and also where the flood elevation is. I know it's hard to see right here, but you see this nice little blue line. And we have, like this here is 110 State Street. The blue line comes in at 5 foot 10 inches of water that was in the basement of 110. You see this first dashed line. This first dashed line is the base flood elevation, also known as the 100-year flood, also known as 1% chance of year flooding. That elevation is at 525.4. So that would be that base flood elevation. The next line above it is through FEMA and also through ANR is the base flood elevation plus 2 feet. And we'll get into more of that later, but that is a key line to be looking at. Right here on 110, it's the bottom of the joist, the floor joist of the first floor.
So the key line is you have 100-year flood, which is that dotted line that you can barely
Bottom
see.
dotted line, yes.
Okay, so that 5 inches of water in the basement didn't quite read.
Almost 5 feet of water.
5 feet,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. didn't quite reach the 100-year
Oh,
flood.
it's pretty close to the 100-year flood in that, yes. That is-
So then on top of that, there's another 2 feet that is FEMA and A&R right now. Is that right now?
We're going to hear about that this afternoon through Doug Farnham and why that base flood elevation plus 2 feet is important, because it will impact planning for us moving forward.
So I just wanted to point that out, and you're going to see that in all of these slides that I'm running.
Okay, so I think we have some questions here. Wayne?
So the flooding into those basements wasn't by infiltrations flowing through doors and windows, that sort of thing? How did the water get in?
Very interesting. I spent many days wandering around looking at this to see exactly how we flooded in so many locations, and it's multiple. There are some holes in our foundations. There is also impact for some who had windows in the basement area under doors. Water did seep in around the doors and the windows. When I arrived here Tuesday morning and was checking buildings, I went to 111 State Street, the Supreme Court building, and went into the basement. At that point in time, it had like 6 inches of water in the basement. It was bubbling out of the water cooler. So the belief is, because there's no significant holes in any of our buildings, that it also infiltrated through the wastewater system. Which makes for not pleasant
wastewater
water.
system. Can't have a building without a wastewater system.
That is very true.
I've had that problem with buildings that I had before too, where it was a geyser coming up in the basement.
Yes.
And you saw that in the streets as well, and the water was coming out of catch basins because there was just so much water.
They had no place to go. You know, when we saw that aerial view, there was so much impacted, and that is putting pressure. So there, anything in the waste stream has no place to go. And water likes to seek its own elevation. There was, since we did bring that up, is throughout all of these buildings in different areas, that there were doors that were separating areas. Certainly when we go into 111, 109, 133, there were different water levels because the doors were withholding back some of the water. And towards the end of this presentation, you'll see a nice little photo where that gave way. In here, also, I did some fun math on the fact that 110 State Street had roughly, ironically, almost 110,000 gallons of water. Now, that's only in the measured cubic feet that we did. As we were pumping water out, we shut down. First night, we stopped around 10:30 at night. We came back, we pumped down 6 inches, we gained 3 overnight. So we actually pumped out a lot more water than the volume that basement's held. So 110 State Street, you can see here, before, now the before was by ServPro, who we came in to do our cleanup and do all of the demolition that needed to take place for all the wet damaged materials and the likes of that, and made it nice. The right-hand photo, nice spotly clean. Anything that was impacted by floodwaters had to be dealt with that was an impervious material for cleanup. There'll be more coming on that on the electrical systems. The electrical systems were not designed to be inundated with water, so they too will have to be replaced.
So 110 State Street, if folks remember, is the building that we put up for sale. Down here by the Taylor Street Bridge.
That is correct. So you can see after the cleaning crew was in here, you can see on this air handler right here, there's a cut line. So there's a lot of locations where you'll see a cut line where the contractor came in to cut off above the water line and remove those wet materials. Some areas are different than others. It all depends how much water was in them and how long they actually had a soak time. Moving to 116 State Street. 116 had only about 20 inches of water in it.
And 116 State Street, just to help folks, is the agriculture building.
And we had 61,000 gallons of water in the basement. You can see it's not quite close to the 100-year flood. It's pretty close. Here, along with the typical infiltration, this is the accessible entrance into the building. It comes into the basement. And so when that door somewhat let go, which would be the end of this corridor here, coming up the ramp, we have a ramp that comes in. So we had water infiltration. If that accessible entrance wasn't there, I think we would have a lot less water. But that's the accessible entrance. We got an elevator in there that was impacted, hydraulic elevator. We've also got restrooms, and Ag had some storage stuff and a lot of other things they had in their basement.
Joe, can you explain to the committee about the elevator situations when elevators are not in use, where they go?
They go down. Got a good video for that too. Not as best as I'd hoped, but we got one. So what happens is on a hydraulic elevator, and it's an open tank of hydraulic fluid. When I say open, it does have a cover on it, but it's free to the air. So as it's coming back into the tank, so the elevator's coming down and the oil has to come out of the piston, goes back into the tank and it's vented to the air. What was happening there was the floodwaters are coming in, it had gone into that tank and displaced the fluid, and elevators drop down to the basement. So normally our elevators are not parked in the basement. So in this situation, there is by code now to have a water sensor in your pit, but that would not have helped us because it actually impacted the hydraulic fluid tank itself. So the cars then dropped.
So going forward, very simple thinking is that hydraulic tanks should not be in the basement.
Correct.
And you want to make sure your elevators, when they're not used, go up to the top floor.
Right. There's a lot of other things that shouldn't be in the basement.
That's one little example.
Come to find out. Basements are great free space, however. So 126 State Street. I have no idea what happened to my floor plan on 126. Oh, here we go. 126 is as you're facing south and looking at the DMV building, it's the next building across the drive to its right. The Veterans Affairs and Commission on Women are in that building. We have roughly 6'7" water in the basement, basically right to the joist. Although this did not impact the first floor, by the time we got the water pumped out of there, we did have to replace the carpet because just because of that moisture, it wicked up into the carpet and we had to remove that. Let's see, for reference, 126, 74,000 gallons roughly in the basement of that. And so you can see down here in the basement of 126, even though it's a relatively small building, the impact is quite great. On the left-hand photo, you'll see this white insulated tubular shaped device, and it's also uninsulated on the right-hand photo, and that's a heat exchanger. So that is exchanging our steam to hot water. So the heat exchanger itself is fine, but all that pipe insulation had to be removed. All the controls that you can see with valves and tags and everything else also electrically has to be replaced. Sprinkler systems. If the sprinkler head was facing up, the head has to be replaced because debris could be impacting that. Oh, I told you there's not a water. 128, Secretary of State's office. Had 5 foot 7 feet of water in there. That had a lot of storage in there. Also for 128, also had a lot of control work in there. And these buildings again are connected by different sized pipes for steam, data, phone, one case water. And so that also helped that as one building filled up, it had an easy way to go to the next building also to equalize the basements. This basement had 119,000 gallons. You can see here, this whole partition wall here had to be removed. You can see down in here, we have a condensate pump. As I mentioned earlier, that's in the lowest portion. So when your steam is coming in, that's going to be at the low point to pump it back to the plant. 13 Green Mountain Drive. 13 Green Mountain Drive is again outside of the state complex. You go towards State Street, Bailey Avenue, Memorial Drive. You can take a right just past the high school. It's at the far end. It's a small little building. However, in that building there, we had roughly 4 feet of water in the basement, roughly 129,500 gallons of water in the basement. So you can see the photo on the left-hand side, nice sheetrock walls. And on the right-hand side photo, all that sheetrock ceiling, because of that moisture just leaking up, had to be removed. There's also a boiler. This one is not connected to the heat plant, has its own boiler and air handler, and they were in the basement. Moving on to group two. Group two, again, south side of State Street. A little bit further down, we're impacted now on the basement floors, completely inundated the basement and got up to the first floor. First one up is 132 State Street, the auditor's building. Again, you can see where the lines here, I know they're hard to read, but basically the 100-year flood, basement, the water in the basement got to that level in this building. The base flood elevation, it's above the first floor. I have roughly 13 inches of water on the first floor. And that's roughly where that 100-year flood elevation is. And then you have the 2 feet that we'll talk about later. 132 State Street had roughly 80,000 gallons in the basement and the first floor. So here, a nice photo of this actually is wet. It had not been cleaned yet. We just got in to take the photos. And out to the right-hand side, you see where they came in and cut 4 feet up on the plaster. That also had insulation in the wall and something called back plaster. There was another coating of plaster towards the outside wall. All that had to be removed. We had actually 4 different flooring systems in this building.
So we have a question here. Sure.
Were you able to replace the plaster walls with sheetrock, or did you have to stick with historic preservation?
So that's to be determined in the future.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things that we have been very clear on is that can't make any, if the state of Vermont makes any, what is considered to be permanent repairs on any of these buildings, then we jeopardize FEMA funding. So right now, and I know this comes a little later, we're putting all buildings on temporary power and temporary systems, and we'll talk about what that means. But it also means that any buildings that were impacted on the first floor, we're not putting back flooring or wall at this point in time. Because again, we don't want to jeopardize our ability to leverage FEMA funding.
Wayne?
So when will the FEMA process get you to the point where you can do that?
That is a great question, and I'm going to hold that question for Doug Farnham, because that's when he'll come in and he'll talk about the process. And, you know, Madam Chair, I know you were here for Tropical Storm Irene, and I'm sure you are well aware that there is a lengthy process that we will need to go through. But Doug, again, will speak to that this afternoon.
Kristen and then John.
Thanks, Joe. What is back plaster? I need to.
It's another layer of plaster towards the outside wall. And so that was sort of another air barrier. So you had 2 layers, and that was sort of the insulation of the day.
Like up against the back of the sheathing?
Almost. It did not touch the sheathing. So we plastered the inside wall that had a nice finish. The outside just had lath and a coating of plastic.
John?
The river basically went back into its banks late Tuesday. At what point were you able to start pumping, and how did you muster the forces that necessary for the pumping?
We started making phone calls sometime in the morning to find a firm to come in and start pumping. When they got here, Ethan, do you remember the time?
I wasn't here.
Sorry.
They were here right around 6 o'clock.
I think we pumped at 10:30 that night and did our best of getting, set up. We were doing 109, 111, 110, and 133 at that point in time at that night. Then again, we regrouped because we weren't making a lot of headway. Also because of requirements for truck drivers. If they go home now, they could come back in at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, as opposed to if we went further into the night, then they weren't allowed to drive. So all that came into play too.
Was that part of Service Pro?
It was ahead of ServPro.
Okay,
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the first phone calls that we made in this process was to call the insurance company. And the first thing the insurance company said to us was, do whatever you need to do to prevent further damage.
there you go.
And so we immediately started pumping out the basements, and obviously we'll talk about ServPro, but we had them on board very quickly.
So what you were doing is trying to keep the water in the basements from getting higher.
Correct.
So you weren't trying to clear the basement of the existing water. You're trying
Some of it was to clear it as that water was receding.
Yeah.
By the time they showed up when we were at 110 State Street, the water was off the street.
So were you able to keep up with the water coming in?
We were able to keep up with it, but then when we shut down, the water came back. Some of it came back in because that was at that point in time, The infiltration, I don't believe was in the sewer system, it was just the leaks through the foundation and the likes of that.
Because my thinking is, I mean, in some cases, you may be able to re-engineer some things so water that can't get in as well.
Correct.
But there's also the possibility of having a pump system in there that would keep it.
Yes, that comes to mitigation later, but as we learned, and when we were doing 122 State Street, because of the depth of the slab of the basement of that building, we took mitigation measures to make sure that that slab actually would not lift up. We put in 140 some odd soil anchors to keep that slab anchored so we could stay dry. So that's one of those things you have to consider also, that if you're going to be pumping out your basement, other things could happen when the water elevation is high. So if you're going to mitigate, that has to be addressed. So,
Float your building.
yes.
For reference, it took us 4 to 5 days to pump out the basements of 133, 111, and 109 because there was just so much water. And to Joe's point, to some extent, water was coming back in as well.
John?
Did BGS have a pre-plan for flooding?
So as I said, right, operations and maintenance, we did work very closely to plan for the event, but it became 7 to 8 feet higher than what we anticipated. So, we had sandbagged, we had moved cars out of the way, we did a lot of other preparatory, flood mitigation strategies, but unfortunately the water came much higher than we were anticipating.
Now you got a pre-plan.
Much higher than what historically Montpelier had seen in human eyes.
That's right, and you were working really closely with the National Weather Service, right? And they are the group that will make predictions on how high a river is going to rise based on the gauge and how much water we're supposed to be getting and all of those different things. And again, throughout the day on Monday, it just continued to rise, their prediction. And we did the best we could to get ahead of it. But as you said, this is the highest other than 1929, I believe. This is the 1929, 27, 1927. I believe this is our second highest, at least in the complex, flooding event.
In fact, then we didn't have so many mechanicals in the building to begin with. Just
My second flood was in November.
It froze after it happened.
Yeah.
So it's a historically high flood, but also during the event, the estimations are changing rapidly. So that's another thing you're hamstrung.
That's right, and we worked with the administration on evacuation. What time should we evacuate the buildings, again, based on the roadway conditions and whether or not people could get home. And that also included our staff, right? We want to make sure that our staff is safe as well. So we did have a couple of staff members from operations and maintenance that stayed overnight in the complex and stayed overnight in Waterbury as well. Again, to just monitor the flood levels, and if there was anything that they could do, they were there. But there was so much water coming in that they were monitoring and reporting back, and they were doing walkthrough of buildings, but there was little they could do on their own.
On to 134 State Street, the visitor center, it's a red building further west of 132. And that one here also got impacted on the first floor. The gallons that we had in that building was almost 97,000 gallons. And if you've been in the visitor center, they had a lot of display stuff in on the photo on the left-hand side. The water level in this building was approximately 30 inches. And you can see then on the photo on the right, it's been completely removed. I think there was like four different floor systems in this building also. Had a HVAC unit, air handling unit in the basement. 136 State Street. This is the Vermont Arts Council is in that building, but there's also the birthplace for Pat Leahy, Senator Leahy was in this. This building was also impacted on the first floor, at roughly 2 feet of water on the first floor, and 109,000 gallons total basement in the first floor. This interior shot of where we had to remove. 144, the last building on the south side of State Street. This building does not have a basement. It's only a slab on grade. However, it received the first floor elevation, roughly 5 feet of water in it. So if you drive by that building for a good visual, later on there'll be a nice photo showing it also. There's an awning window and then a fixed window on top of that. Basically came to the top of the awning window. So everything in there was impacted. We had roughly 126,000 gallons in that basement. First floor. So you had a nice, ceiling, movable wall system, partitions, all that basically gone. Depends on, you can see in the photo on the left, there's some desks that are at different heights. Some desktops did well, did not get wet. Some got wet. However, by the time it was all pumped out, we got in there, it all had to go. Wood soaks up water, even just standing there below it. And we're going to group 3, which is the north side. Here we'll have a nice little video that I'm going to show you. This is in the elevator lobby of the pavilion. It's in the basement. And on the bottom left-hand side, right now you see this nice little white streak that's coming out of our mechanical space. Along that same stretch, when we headed down towards the bottom of the video, still on the left-hand side, you're going to see 3 lights that come out. And those are our elevators dropping to the basement floor and the door opening. On the right-hand side, you'll see where it is a fast video because of the length of time this actually took to take place, that the Coke machine and the food machine go dark. Watch the left-hand side, you'll see the lights coming. Blink, blink, blink.
The governor's elevator was the last elevator to drop.
So the first elevator was at 5:28 a.m. the 11th. The second was 6:26 a.m. and the governor's held out to 8:39. The water continued to rise. We had roughly 6'1", 6'2" feet of water in this very. So our electrical system was shut off. Our server system for cameras, so we don't have much more video. It also died. Otherwise, it would have been nice to watch that water continue to drip.
So Joe, in the pavilion, you go down where the auditorium is.
Yes.
You go down that stairway to the auditorium. As you are at that first landing, before you have the final flight of stairs down, there's a set of doors there.
Yes.
Did water come through those doors?
It did. I don't have a video here in the slide deck. That would have been another nice one. As I arrived on Tuesday morning, it was roughly 10 to 15 inches of water throughout the day at that door. It was just nicely cascading down the stairs.
Nice. So in the pavilion, from when we met, my understanding is those are the hydraulic elevators that failed because of the contamination of the fluid.
The floodwaters got into the hydraulic tanks and displaced it. That is correct.
Okay. But that was the only place that.
No, all of our 110 State Street had a hydraulic elevator.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. That has a traction elevator. 116 has a hydraulic elevator that was impacted. 109, 133.
Anything with the Supreme Court?
Supreme Court had a traction elevator. It was okay.
Traction elevators did much better than the hydraulic elevators. And interestingly enough, the traction elevators, at least in the Capitol complex, are older.
Very small.
But they did really well in the flooding event.
Those are cable.
Those are cable, and all that equipment is usually up in the rooftop or penthouse above.
Are they still in?
I was wondering what happened to the tunnel that goes out from the pavilion? Was it entirely inundated with water, or did it keep water out? What happened? Because I know we had to put some money in for.
But the tunnel slopes from 111 down to 133 State Street. And it looks as if the water came in from the 133 State Street side at some point, and then it equalized. So at the 133 side, it was probably almost all impacted, 7 feet or better at that side. And then it tapered to maybe 4 or 5 feet on the 111 side.
So is the tunnel operational right now?
Oh, yeah. Well, because it's basically an empty tunnel. It does have a steam line running through there. All the insulation was removed and has been reapplied so that we can have steam on to the complex. The electrical lighting in there is only temporary. It has to be removed, but you can walk through it.
But we have all of our basement spaces, including the tunnel, closed off at this point in time, and we'll talk about that.
Wendy?
Are the traction elevators still being installed today, or is it?
Yes. Oh, your cable, yes.
Okay, good.
So 109, you can see, and this is also combined with 111 because of the connector. Everything in the basement of 109 was impacted. There were 3 different levels of water in 111. Because of how we-
The Supreme Court?
Supreme Court, correct. So doors had that impact where the water was coming in and flowing around. But again, 111 also had it coming in through the drinking fountain. So combined, in 109, we had 880,000 gallons of water. 111 had 118,000 gallons of water. And again, that was just the volume of doing the measurement. Here's the tunnel. We have the tunnel, there's 2 tunnels. One goes from 111 to 133, 133 to 6 Baldwin. As I already spoke on the tunnel to between 111 and 133, the tunnel between 133 and 6 Baldwin was completely full. That elevator, traction elevator 6 Baldwin was up. Very minimal impact to that elevator. 133 State Street. The basement was completely inundated. As we arrived on early Tuesday morning, we continued to check buildings and we just watch it continually rise in 133 State Street. It was roughly 6'9" in the elevator basement pump. And so as you can see in this section view of 133, you have the basement on the right-hand side of the section view. And then we have our sub-basement. And that sub-basement was completely inundated with water. That's where the generator is, all our mechanical and electrical systems are. Unless there's a few others dispersed throughout the building, but those are the chillers, the likes of that, all in that sub-basement, completely covered in water. This was the only building that lost power during the flooding. We had transformers in this building, and so we're not sure what came first, but we do have a video clip of the generator coming on and then going off once it was completely flooded. But on Tuesday night, 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, it was a little bit eerie because all the buildings still had the power on, the lights were on. We did flag down Green Mountain Power as they were driving around to pull the electrical to primary, so no one got electrocuted. Let's see, 133 had 1.4 million gallons of water.
1.4 million.
1.4. Now, we did have, that took us almost 5 days and then some, really to pump out. We brought in an 8-inch pump, and that pumped for 2 days to get it, most of it out. But again, some of it started infiltrating back in. It was at its lowest, the lowest point that we have in the complex. So until that river really dropped, we couldn't get ahead of it. So there was also a lift issue also that we have of getting that water out of there because of its depth. So the photo that you see here is 109 State Street. What was the beloved auditorium, I guess. You're looking at the stage, and on the right-hand side, it's still the auditorium. The chairs are now missing because they were cloth. Had to go the carpet and all the walls.
So on that left-hand side, if you look on the wall, on the right-hand side, it's dark.
Right here?
At a certain point, is that where the water?
That is the water level.
Yep.
And that is now finally dried. You can still lightly see it over here in the right-hand photo, and it's been cleaned and it has been dried out.
So all the chairs and everything are now gone.
Gone.
I'd also like to point out, Madam Chair, that in the back behind the stage, and you can see it on the right-hand side, that was David Sheet's storage area for his artifacts. Our curator.
How much was in there?
He had 3 different storage areas, and they were checker block full of various pieces of furniture, artifacts, those kinds of things. His portraits are not held there. They're held in 6 Baldwin. So his portraits fared well because there was no flood damage to them, but furniture, other artifacts were damaged.
How's David doing?
David, you know David. David was fairly upset. And he spent several days going through the collection and determining what we would keep and restore and what we would discard of.
And also on 133 State Street, there was a lot of storage there as well. Some legislative storage.
That's correct, ma'am.
It was our IT. And there was damage there as well.
Yes.
Correct.
This is one of the electrical closets in the basement of 109. Where this photo was taken, one's looking right, one's sort of looking left. You can see this sort of a V-shaped, L-shaped portion of the building here. So on the right-hand photo, you'll see 3 big gray boxes. Those are the door control system of the building. We have a large electrical panel, transformer. This transformer behind this individual is actually a new one. Benoit Electric was very good at finding equipment for us. They found 4 transformers for us to replace so we could start getting stuff up and running. Again, this is all temporary. They went through, opened up all the electrical panels, took off all the wires and cables off of breakers, cleaned them, cleaned the breakers, dried it all out, put it all back together, and hoped for the best. So far, it's been working.
But this is temporary.
This is temporary, Madam Chair. That is
And is it still, my understanding, you have temporary generators? Or is this wired into the permanent lines?
These are all permanent wired. There are temporary generators still on the complex over at 133 State Street in 109, and they are for the chillers. So remember, July was not only wet, but damp and humid. And so we were racing to get air conditioning back into our buildings so that we had environmental control to prevent additional mold growth. So we have served power in the basements. They were heating it and drying it, keeping the fires running. We were trying to cool off the upper floors. So because of the transition of Serplo out and gone, HP Cummings, the contract we brought in to start putting stuff back together, now has control of the chillers and the generators that are there. Now with the cold weather, we don't need the chillers. And so we're now doing heat. Not all heat is onto all buildings.
Those generators that are there now are only for the next year and a half at the most?
For the chillers until there's a plan to do something with all this electrical. Right.
How many electrical contractors do you have? Do you have just one, or have you hired a number of them to do all this work?
We started, K Southworth was down here on day 2, I believe, day 2 or 3. Brought in Benoit Electric, and they were able to get up and running and start this process. Then we contracted with a construction management firm, not knowing what the damage was, what we had to put back to make it safe and to secure our buildings and also potentially reoccupy the undamaged floors. We then stopped with Benoit Electric, and they worked under HP Cummings, and they did mainly the north side of the street. Then they run another electrical firm in to help with the south side. Is that correct? No, I'm sorry, that was Mechanical Systems. So one electrical outfit did it all. They did it. They're still here, plugging away and doing a great job.
And Benoit Electric has been fantastic and fantastic to work with.
They've done jumped through hoops.
They really have.
And so has all of our contractors have actually.
Cool. Very good.
This is a mechanical room in 109. This is the air handling systems for 111 State Street, Judiciary Building, Supreme Court, and also the connector of 109. So this goes to all 5 floors of the governor's office. It's all up and running right now to provide air and heat. This here is looking in the hallway going, if you've taken the tunnel on the left-hand side photo, is looking from the Supreme Court building basement towards the tunnel. And so in this hallway here, where the photo is being taken from is roughly, there's a doorway. On the Supreme Court side of that door, there's roughly 30 inches of water. On the opposite side where this photo was taken, was basically only about 15 inches. That also fed down the ramp to 109. Where this, at the end of the hallway, And then, Halloween's coming, the horror shot here. The end of the hallway was electrical panels and transformers in there also. That was down lower. And then also right in the tunnel.
And what you can't see, but what is really interesting is if you look on the photo on the right, you can kind of see that plastic kind of sticking in through the photo. If that wasn't there and you were able to see straight back, they did a mark on the wall for the 1927 flood that we found when we opened up the wall.
And that was roughly right at this elevation is where the 27th flood was.
We have another flood 10, 15, 20 years. How high did that one go? There was another one.
92?
No, it's 92.
When we did the ice storm, we did not do as bad. Again, it was running down State Street. There was not a lot of pressure on the the sewer systems.
And it was pretty short-lived.
It was.
Because once they broke up the ice jam, it was about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, then the water just went right back. And then it got really cold out.
Yeah, see, my thinking is, I mean, you're talking about this now, and, you know, we got our 100-year floods, our 50-year floods, you know, all that kind of stuff. But we also are very restricted in how wide this floodplain is down this point in time, so I would anticipate we're gonna have more flood events coming. So the question then is, what's the worst case? And if you're looking at the worst case scenarios, then how do you rebuild what you've got now to minimize damage in the future? So you need to have some concept of, you know, how bad it could get. So I don't know whether you consider hydrologists, hydrogeologists, and looking at this particular section of the watershed, because it's not going to be the same everywhere, because just the way this constriction is here. And might be worth getting some ballpark idea.
And we did that in Waterbury. We will have some slides later on about the resources we brought in, but we brought in a hydrologist.
We'll get into that more this afternoon.
Right, we do have some experience in terms of when we rebuilt the Waterbury complex. No one's here for that.
I had nothing to do with Waterbury though, thankfully.
Yeah.
I helped out a little bit, but I was still with BGS. But yes, we took care of the East region. I know, don't go there.
You don't go there.
So any questions, John?
What was fire prevention's role during the part of the event, and how has it evolved to at the end of October?
Fire prevention came in, I think, not only through the complex, but throughout all towns and cities that were impacted. Floodwaters were inspected when it got wet, and we're putting placards on the buildings saying that, you needed an electrical inspection basically before you could reoccupy. Or it was even worse than that if there may be some structural issues. I did not see them on the first couple of days that they were wandering around, but then we were having conversations with fire safety on a regular basis as to this is what we're looking to do with the buildings. And before we reoccupy, they come in and do an inspection. Fire marshal comes in, the electrical inspector, plumbing inspector comes in, and we describe what the impact was and also what we've done to put it back up and running. And they give us approval to move back in.
And fire safety's been another incredible partner because they've made themselves available to us so that we can reopen buildings. So they've been fantastic.
So the photo on the left here is for 133 State Street. And this is the basement elevator lobby. At least the water is gone. You can still see the wet muck on the floor, so it was still early in the flood stages. We had 7'9" water in here, so it's roughly to the top of this door. You can, probably not from the distance, but right around here you can see a little bit of a difference in color in the gray paint, but that is where the water elevation was, just in the basement. As I said, in that sectional view that I showed, it goes down. There's 16 feet or so down below to our next level. Photo on the right is, Serpro was in doing some cleaning and clearing things out. You'll see up here this piece of plastic because we did not want to get into removing all that marble surround, but there was a void. So anywhere there was a void in a wall or it was porous materials, it came out. I really didn't want to remove all that marble. So what we did is we cut holes above and drove air down so it could be drying out from behind and saving it. There are some areas where we did remove marble and we saved it. Again, 133 State Street, if you've been in the basement on the left-hand side photo, you can see all the artwork running down the hallway, the red carpet, and that is looking from the center of the L shape as you're coming from the elevators going towards the tunnel. The view on the right is roughly the same area, but as you can see, all the walls, ceilings, everything else in that basement is removed, the metal studs.
And that was one of the areas that Kevin Moore stored
Right over here.
training room and
Oh, yeah.
like council had things in there. And I think our cafeteria chairs that have been taken out previously
Right.
were in there and those all got
On
destroyed.
the right-hand side of on the right-hand photo was the Ledge IT storage area. And they built their computers and likes of it there. And on the left-hand side of this photo was the training room, and then the training room in the back. Outside of the picture was Tax also had a storage room down there that was heavily impacted, lost probably everything. And then behind us, as you can't see, is the storage area where the chairs were for the cafeteria and a few other items that was stored on the tables.
Not all the chairs. It's when with COVID, we took out quite a number of chairs from the cafeteria, about half of the cafeteria chairs that used to be there prior to COVID. We're in this and we lost those.
So here we have the early on in the flood, because the cameras were still on. Elevation, the basement lobby of 133 State Street, the elevator lobby. And off to the right, you can start to see this little flow, a ripple in the waters. So you'll see where the water comes through. There'll be, as the water comes in, we have motion lights in our basement, actually in a lot of our buildings for energy conservation. They picked up the motion of the water, and you'll see it get a little bit bright for a bit because our water came on. But again, actual was just above this shadow line is the high water mark. Watch the right, here comes the water. And our brand new waste dispenser that we had for our, what's going to be a grab and go cafeteria that we just finished christening, basically waiting for the vendor come out through. So what happened is there was a lot of water that we know on the front of the building. We had punctured some holes, a vent, piping going through for our under slab heat for our walkways out front. And so we know we got excess water that came in there. It was held back by the wall and a door. But once that wall got saturated, it just blew through. And that's what you're seeing coming through across the hallway. That's all I have for slides.
It's unbelievable with what you've accomplished. Thank you. Right?
Yeah, I was going to add my thanks too to BGS. Great job. We're all deeply in debt. I noticed on the map, Group 3 appears to be the most seriously impacted of the groups. And I'm kind of wondering, to Wayne's point too, I think, we're in a situation where you would think that it would almost evenly come over the bank. There's got to be a reason for that, why it went north and not, because there's buildings on the south that, like 110 wasn't impacted at all. And you would expect maybe that there'd be even damage, if I'm saying it correctly, on both sides of the river, no?
The buildings are different elevations.
Okay.
Different ways of the way the water came in and what it had for equipment in the basement. Yes, the north side was impacted the greatest. 109 State Street originally was constructed in 72, I believe it was opened. And then we did an addition in the early 80s. For the mechanical systems and everything else were in the basement there. So there's a lot more equipment size-wise and everything else because of the size of those buildings. 5-story buildings versus a 4, the footprint is a lot smaller on all the buildings across the street. 133 State Street, we renovated that starting, I think, 2002. All new electrical and mechanical systems, generator, because at that time it was CIT and not ABS, our IT outfit. And so we had larger chillers and generator in the basement because they were all upstairs. So what you have, and we'll get into this a little bit more this afternoon, is the fact that the basements were nice open areas to put all this equipment as opposed to taking up good square footage on your first floor.
Yeah.
So yes, going forward, is that really something to do? No. And also, we cannot, is really what it's running out to.
Thanks, Joe.
Fantastic job on the slides. We had the chance to see it in real life, and you guys did a remarkable job of making sure the committee could see it, both committees could see it. I think what really made it real for me was seeing that auditorium. You know, that auditorium was just a beautiful, something that you get to see in state buildings. Sometimes you just trying to see a sterileness of, office space or whatever, but to see that auditorium where you'd been proud to sit in anywhere in the country and sit in there and watch whatever was going on before you, to see that to the level of where it was very disheartening.
Empty. Yeah, it was. I agree. That was one of the most devastating pieces.
Thank you very much. Can you speak a little bit to the mold threat? And it sounds as if you're past that part, but it's hard especially in the inside spaces where you didn't want to take things out. So are you past the of mold threat?
So it's a good question. And the other thing is, starting out in the presentation, we should have framed kind of the different chapters or different phases of our recovery, right? So the first phase is the immediate response phase. That's going to deal with that mold, and I'll respond to that here in a second. The second phase is what we're doing right now, which is putting buildings on temporary power and temporary systems so that we can get the buildings up and running again and that they can be occupied, right? And that last phase is going to be the final recovery phase, where we're determining what we're going to do to build back better and make our buildings more resistant in the future. That phase will take some time, and Doug will talk a little bit today and set the stage for that. But that phase is going to take some time. So in the initial phase, we brought in a company called ServPro. There are ServPros throughout the United States. It's a franchise. We did reach out to our local ServPro, but as you can imagine, they were overwhelmed and only had so much staff here in Vermont. And so eventually we found another franchise that was able to come, and they came as early as we were having conversations later in the week, that first week, and then they started bringing in their staff members over the weekend. They had 150 people here at one point. And these men and women are fantastic. Also, ServPro was amazing with their employees as well. They were always wearing their protective equipment. One day they would do special things for them. One day they brought in an ice cream truck for them because it was a hot day. And they did a lot of other things to kind of keep morale up on the team. So that was amazing. And really what their job was in the first few days is to come in and start removing all of the wet materials from the basements. Apparently, I learned that in the 90s, after the 90s flood, BGS put out a guidance to say, don't store anything in basements. But we never made it an administrative policy. So that is something that we'll be working on. So hopefully that administrative policy will live on through successive administrations and allow us to hold people more accountable to that. So the first few days was really just taking things out of the basements. Then the next step was to remove all of the muck. So mucking out is an actual term. I thought it was just kind of jargon. And someone said, no, it's really called mucking out. And what that is you take all that kind of wet sludge that kind of remains after they pump out the basements, and you basically scoop it into a trash bag. And you take those trash bags out, and that's how they get the muck out. And then after that, they start removing wet materials. And so, for example, on the first floors that were affected, right, they were removing the sheetrock or the plaster. And then they're also simultaneously trying to dry out the buildings. Now this is coming to the mold piece. So we want to get those environmental controls up and running. We want ventilation, and we either want heating or cooling depending on where you are in the building to dry it out. As Joe said, the concern is, and to your point, even though the moisture was only in the basements or the first floors, it has the ability to rise through successive floors in the building, right? So you want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence on kind of drying it out and keeping that ventilation going. On the bottom floors, it's really hot. The upper floors, it's cold. And again, that's how that moisture works. Kind of goes back to State House HVAC and how we dry out the air in the summertime. And so that was ongoing. And the final phase, once we did all of that work, was they came in and they disinfected for bacteria. and then, and obviously cleaned. And then we had, it wasn't Atlas, was it Atlas? We had a company come in, a third party, and they basically came in and tested for mold, moisture, and bacteria. And only if those buildings met or were lower than the thresholds were we able to then bring in fire safety to clear the buildings after that for occupancy. So there definitely was a process and a pattern, but to your point, yes, you have to be concerned about mold all the time. You need to get the wet materials out as quick as you can, and then you need to start drying it out as fast as you can. But we, Joe and I, and Dave, our deputy commissioner, who's not here today, we would do our nightly walk. And so every night, Joe and I would, around 5 o'clock, would jump in the buggy and we'd spend 2 to 3 hours touring all the buildings, all the floors, making sure that all the fans were working, checking ServPro to make sure every once in a while you'd find a fan out, needs power or something. Or we'd find, hey, we've got this temporary ventilation tube, for lack of a better term, but it really needs some more holes in it, or we need more air. And so Joe and I would walk around the buildings. If we found something needed to be turned on, we did. Or if we found we need to open a bigger hole in the ventilation, we did. Or we would call ServPro and say, hey, we need more air, for example. So we were working hand in hand with ServPro the entire time. But yes, you got to get right on top of it, or you will be concerned about mold, not only where you were impacted, but again, rising into the rest of the building. So you have to stay on top of it. And that was part of that nightly walk that we did. 7 days a week, three weeks straight, we did that walk.
Oh, thank you.
Double,
Yeah.
double thing. John and then Chip?
Could you elaborate a little bit on ServPro's level of cleaning? I know when I came up, I saw them with toothbrushes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
The level of cleaning was spectacular.
It was incredible. So, they did their muck out first, getting rid of all of the dirt off the floor and whatnot. Then they were coming through and removing the sheetrock and the things like that. Ahead of them may or may not have been an electrician also to make sure everything was completely dead and locked out. And then once all the debris was removed, they did their cleaning. That cleaning did involve, whether it's a toothbrush, brushes, everything else, because of the potential of mold of actually cleaning everything. So even on pipes that had insulation on them, they removed the insulation, actually took a brush to all the pipes, cleaned them up. So it looked great, almost like new going in there. And then they had really their final cleaning, which was coming through with their biocide and making sure that anything that was exposed was actually wiped down. So if you envision like a metal stud that we use in a lot of buildings now, it's C-shaped. So you get a nice little 1/4-inch lip. So they're running cloths up and down that edge, then the next edge, and working their whole way around the track, the floor, everything else. When the testing company came in, we first tested at 144 State Street. The test was 0 to 50, 50 to like 100. And if you were over 100, you had to completely rewash. 50 to 100, you could spot check and clean. 0 to 50, you passed. I want to say that we were under 10. I don't remember the exact digit we were, but the testing company was surprised at how clean it was. So they did a great job of coming through.
It's probably cleaner than before the flood.
I'm sure it was. Come to my house.
They're not cheap.
So isn't there a technology that we can use to waterproof our basements? Can't we reinforce and waterproof the walls to try and mitigate the water that comes in and seal the holes that might be there?
That's going to be further conversations.
Correct. That's for the future, but yes, there are. Like we did the 120 State Street, also the 122 State Street. Those two buildings have been mitigated to a certain extent to limit the amount of water getting in. And if water does come in, you're going to go to the sump pumps and pump it out.
Yep.
122, we had failure of the sump pump themselves by debris getting in. In 120, we had it because a fitting came loose. But it all depends at what expense that you can do that. I don't know the dollar amount that we spent on those for that flood mitigation. We spent a lot of money in the heat plant because we needed that space in the basement to drive soil anchors into the ground to hold that slab down. That was not done at 120 State Street, but we did dig up the whole exterior around the foundation, waterproof the foundation, put in a whole drainage pump system. So the pumps that are outside of 120 that pick up all the exterior water are actually fed off of the generator out of the heat plant. So you had pumps outside collecting water and pumps inside. So it is a lot of work, and to what extent? So there is something called dry flood proofing. And those two buildings have been done, but it is not inexpensive.
So that kind of ties in, depending how we go forward with recovery here, repair, recovery, resilience. That will all be tied into conversations with insurance, and it will all be tied in with conversations to FEMA. And that's what's going to take a lot of time. What we may think is a viable solution may not be approved. And then the decision will need to be made. Well, if we don't get any outside money, do we do it on our own nickel? So those are the balances and discussions that will be occurring for at least a couple legislative sessions for that. Gina, and then Connor.
Yeah, do you have an approximate price tag on what was spent thus far and price tag on what ServPro was itself?
Just over $22 million for ServPro.
22 or 32?
22.
22. Oh.
And overall, do you have any idea?
Ethan, do you know the number of HP Cummings right now, top of your head? Last two invoices?
150,000 so far on HP.
Okay.
Connor?
Yes. I just want to echo the gratitude expressed, was out there every day, talking to BGS workers, and, I think it means a lot when somebody who doesn't necessarily, live in your communities, coming and helping. It's definitely not the job description for a state employee, so there was a lot of hard work there. And this is tough to watch, actually, kind of brings it back a bit. Questions like, we're talking about money. This seems all consuming. And you may have noticed we did 1,000 other things to do in the capital bill. So I'm wondering, what is the staff capacity like as we go forward with the capital bill projects that we've laid out here? Because it seems like it would be the top priority to take care of what we got,
That is an excellent question. When we look back at the Waterbury State Office Complex, we did have, I think, 6 or 7 project managers that were redeployed. And as a result of that, major maintenance was the program that suffered the most. I will tell you that, yes, the flood did create quite a bit of demand. It will have an impact on our ability to advance projects. However, I have been meeting with Joe monthly for the last several months on all the capital bill projects because we recognize those are important as well, and we want to make sure that we continue to advance them. So we are advancing all projects to the best of our ability. But you are correct, there will likely be some impact, though we are trying to get all projects moving forward.
How are the two of you and your staff doing? I can just tell by your presentation how thoroughly exhausted and just a very different expression on each of your face. And I can't thank you enough because I know you take this all to heart, what you've gone through. So again, thank you.
I would thank you for that. I was interviewed by VPR and they said, what has been your biggest challenge to date through this whole thing? And I said, well, every once in a while, one of us gets really overwhelmed. Luckily, it's not all at the same time. So whether that's the deputy commissioner, myself, or Joe, or somebody else on the team, every once in a while, you kind of see that look on somebody's face and they kind of slump down and they feel really overwhelmed. How are we going to make it, right? And then what we do is we are supportive of each other. And we just take one day at a time. That's all you really can do, right? Just focus what's immediately right in front of you, take a deep breath, and know that you can depend on your coworkers as well as the amazing contractors that we've hired as well, who all of the contractors really have been very collaborative, and we've been so impressed with all the work. So it's been an incredible journey. It is a lot of work. I went on vacation 3 weeks after. I worked every single day and I slept for 3 days because I was so exhausted from not sleeping. And then I came back and I think I was a more whole human being after that. But, again, we're relying on each other and it's really just the support.
What can we do?
Well, 3 weeks in July, I missed that. I don't even remember that really. So it was very interesting. It was, strangely though, it was somewhat fun. It's very different. Some of the decisions that you have to make right away through Tay. Tay was very good and very helpful because of his years of experience here at BGS. I think I by a couple of months, really have been here longer than Tay. But with our both experience, Tay's been in the complex and a lot of our buildings, and he was very helpful in getting our equipment back up and running and knowing actually what fed what. If not, he had the knowledge to go chase it down. So he did very well. He was a big help to us.
And it was also really helpful. I mean, it's sad and it's unfortunate, but it's also very helpful that BGS central offices are located here in the Montpelier complex and that all of the buildings that were flooded were here in Montpelier. Versus if it had been statewide, we would have had to deploy resources all over the state, and that would have been much more difficult for us to manage collectively. So it was helpful that we're here and that it happened in Montpelier. I know we'll get to Waterbury later, but I will say there was flooding in Waterbury. All of our buildings were great based on all the work that we did following Tropical Storm Irene. That really speaks to how you can build back better and make more resilient buildings. But, and I don't think we included any videos from that one, but you see the water coming up into the parking lots. It definitely was surrounding the buildings, but we didn't have any water damage inside the facilities.
And that was the plan when we decided to go forward and rebuild. That was the plan.
Outside of the complex question and comment, I've heard quite a bit of criticism of the fact that we built an emergency operations center. The building wasn't affected,
That's right.
but its operation was. And how, basically they said, how could you build something that isn't going to operate when there's an emergency? I believe that they moved up to the airport.
We did, and I was actually there and part of the decision-making process when that happened. And again, it wasn't because of the buildings, it was because of the roadway and people's ability to drive out of Waterbury. My understanding is that both VTrans and the town of Waterbury are looking at the roadway structures to see, again, can they build back better so that flooding doesn't impact the roadways as much there. I can't speak to that, but that's my understanding that planning is happening. And so I was part of the decision-making process. They never left though. And I think that was a misunderstanding. So they physically left the space in Waterbury, but they all went virtual. So they were still on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then the next day, so what happened was a few people in the afternoon left to go set up the DIL to be that emergency operations center. And then the next morning, they stopped being remote and went back into person. But they were always operational. They never stopped operating.
But the key was they wanted to make sure folks could drive.
That's right.
To go home.
That's right.
Or to continue their work.
That's right.
It had nothing to do with the building, it had nothing to do where it was located on state property or state function. The issue was the roadways were flooding.
That is correct.
I'm sure people could get out.
And the Department of Public Safety, their main building is located on the Waterbury State Office Complex, which is why the Emergency Operations Center is inside that building.
Eric?
Besides Montpelier, were there any other state buildings affected in any other counties?
The only other building that got impacted, but it wasn't during the July flooding event, the one that we're talking about, was Asa Bloomer in Rutland. There was another rain event, I think a couple of weeks later, and we did end up getting some flooding in the basement. That's the only building that was affected by flooding over the summer.
Took out a fire alarm panel and damaged 3 elevators.
So I'm gonna move this along because we do have Doug here, but I have one more question. Right now, in the complex, what buildings, if any, are open? Right.
So,
Can we get into this afternoon?
Madam Chair, all of the buildings, with the exception of the Pavilion Building, which is 109, and 133 remain closed. All of the buildings are open. Except for, let me clarify that. There are 4 buildings across the road on the south side of the street that were flooded on the first floor. Those will remain in that state for some time, again, because we can't do anything that looks like a permanent repair or jeopardize FEMA funding, and we take that very seriously, right? Because we want to leverage as much funding as we can. So that would be.
Group 2 buildings?
That would be 132 State Street, 134 State Street, 136 State Street, and 144 State Street. So those ones that are in group 2 that are orange, those ones will remain closed again until such time we make permanent repairs, if we make permanent repairs on those buildings.
So the blue ones are currently occupied?
That's right.
And the green ones are currently occupied?
That's correct.
And the 2 red ones, 3 red ones are not occupied?
So we just opened up the Supreme Court this Monday for occupancy. The Supreme Court is not occupying at this point in time because they're doing an IT upgrade where they're putting new fiber into the building. So once the new fiber's in, they will move in, but they could have occupied starting this Monday.
And how many of these buildings are right now on a generator?
None.
None.
They're all on electrical power. Wow. No, that's all temporary, using the existing systems.
And you don't know how long those existing systems
Are gonna last.
are gonna last.
We have both.
Turn them on and you run, right?
We only did that with 133, but yes.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you, folks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great job.
So Doug, why don't you come on up, the czar for flood recovery? And one thing I want to give a little plug. You know Eric Philcorn very well.
Yes.
These two committees, and you have got a person that can really help you. And you're lucky. And pick his brain. Because he's been a terrific help to our committees. And I know he's been through FEMA issues prior to this. He went through it with Irene. But we on this side, both committees, have so much respect and support for Eric.
Yes,
And
definitely.
you're lucky to have him.
I am, Madam Chair. I'm grateful to Commissioner Fitch for allowing Eric to be tasked to the recovery. And I think he's playing a pretty critical role, helping me coordinate with the federal interagency team. I think there's a potential for Eric to find, honestly, millions of dollars for Vermont through that work.
Make sure you let him come into the building so we can see him.
We miss Eric. He's a extraordinary human being, and he is really good for state government, and always good to see Eric.
So that's our little plug for him. But we wanted you to come in just to talk over all the moving pieces with state commitments, insurance issues, FEMA. This, as I stated at the very beginning, this is new for everyone around this table, except for maybe 2 or 3 of us who are here with Irene. On the outside, we have this perception of what insurance can cover. We have a perception of FEMA. And as you start working with it, there are layers and layers and layers and layers, and it keeps unfolding the further you go. So I wanted an opportunity for the committee to at least have some background in terms of how all these pieces work together and maybe what our responsibility will be over the next few legislative sessions.
Absolutely, Madam Chair. For the record, Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer. I think I make it a policy to try to change my title at least once every year. I tend to go where there's need, Madam Chair. But so yes, this is the recovery from the flood will involve a lot of layers. I'll stick to specifically in the context of the Capitol complex and the state buildings for now. Focus on that. I do think it's helpful that there are fewer layers there. So the first kind of layer, the first gate we cleared, right, is that with insurance, we had building by building, building coverage and contents coverage. And so we had national floodplain insurance, insurance on all of the structures that were flooded. So the amount that that insurance will cover is going to be factored into the math, basically, and help us reduce the amount we need to claim through the FEMA process. So that's the first layer. Then we have our aggregate state policy. And I apologize, for some reason, I know it's either 40 million or 45. I just cannot keep straight in my head whether it's 40 or 45 precisely. I keep switching the numbers. So I know it's at least 40 million is the aggregate cap on our state buildings. So when we add up, and we're still filing all of the contents claims with the insurance, a lot of those insurance initial claim reports, of course, were already filed. The nice thing is this insurance math will flow into the reconciliation with FEMA so that at the end of the day, the legislature can know how much is going to flow onto the FEMA claim and how much we're going to need to come up with match for. But it doesn't hold up the FEMA process. So they kind of run in parallel. We have the insurance claims running, and we've given the insurance companies enough evidence at this point on the aggregate claim that I believe they're very close to issuing us the maximum payment for our aggregate claim because they've seen enough evidence that there's no reasonable way that we're not going to hit that cap, which is a little bit of a pro and con, right? I think we went with the most reasonable flood insurance we could find, and the aggregate cap being where it is definitely going to impact us in an event of this size. And normally a $40 or $45 million cap wouldn't be something we'd have to worry as much about.
So Doug, can I just interrupt you there? For the maximum payment, is the amount that we have to pay ServPro, will that be calculated in that? Or is that kind of outside that? Or we don't know yet?
So I do know, I think it may be, Madam Chair, but I think it also will be moot because our expenses will so dramatically exceed the amount covered by the policy. So those ServPro measures are required by our policy in order to prevent further damage, because if we hadn't gotten ServPro in and pulled the sheetrock and pulled everything and stopped the potential mold, then our insurance companies could have, there's a clause in there that they could have basically denied our claims because they couldn't separate what was flood damage and what was damage due to negligence. So the $20 million plus that we invested in ServPro, I think is a very wise investment, not only for preventing further damage and giving us less to repair in general, but it also protected us from potential loss with the insurance companies. I do believe that some of those expenses are likely eligible under our insurance coverage as costs related to the damages. But the damages to the mechanicals in 109 and 133 in particular, between those two may be by themselves enough to exceed the aggregate cap on our insurance.
So the more, in simple terms, we have to work through our insurance first prior to really FEMA, to know where FEMA is and see where those dollar amounts from our insurance. And then FEMA comes in after the fact. Is that?
It's more in parallel, Madam Chair. So we're working on our insurance claim, and I was actually concerned about this when I first started in my new role, because I thought that we would have to have the insurance amounts locked down and then back those out of our FEMA claim. That's not actually how it works. When FEMA goes through with BGS, and I feel sorry for BGS in this instance, because FEMA is going to go through with them and catalog every item of damage to those buildings. So with the scale of damage, it's an exhaustive process, right? So everything is going to be counted and cataloged in the project workbooks, and we're doing one workbook by building. So it's a very exhaustive line item list of all the damage, down to like the exit signs, like get listed separately as damaged amounts. And so that complete catalog of damage will be compiled by FEMA. And then we have to agree that for any insurance payments we receive, we will back those out of our FEMA claim or return anything that if they send us, so they're going to obligate that full amount. And then they're going to send us some funds, but it's unlikely that they're going to send us money before our insurance claim is settled and allocated. So the likely way it'll work out, we're in the process of scoping out the damage with FEMA, creating that full, scale damage. So within the next, that scoping meeting was what, 3 weeks ago? Somewhere in that range. So we have about 30 to 40 days left to complete the full scoping of damage with FEMA. And that'll be a really useful number because that'll tell us, okay, this is what, and we're going to have, it'll be useful in that it'll show us everything that FEMA considers damage, and we'll have to go back and forth and argue with them a little bit about that. But it gives us the baseline that we can build everything else off of. Our insurance will be settled on the other end, and that insurance claim isn't related to, the insurance companies don't go into as much detail, particularly with the scope of damage being so far above. They don't feel the need to validate it to that extent. When we get the insurance payment, after Irene, FEMA made us allocate that insurance payment equally across all of our structures. It's possible they may make us do it that way again. Allocate the insurance payments by the value related to the structures. There's a couple ways that certain contents and things like that, if those were covered by insurance as opposed to FEMA, it could simplify our process. So we're going to try to work with them and see if they'll work with us on the allocation of insurance monies so that the things that might be more complicated to work through the FEMA process, we just cover those with insurance and we focus on the big ticket items with FEMA and kind of reduce the amount of line items that we're going to have to argue with them about some things, right? So the fewer line items, the easier it'll be to work that out in the long run.
And what about for FEMA, the state match? If I remember with Waterbury, the rebuilding of all that, because you may have a building, but you may have 10 different project worksheets and project numbers that you have to work through FEMA for each one of those projects. And there could be a different state share for FEMA for some of this. Are you running, are we at any of that level of knowing if there's any state share that's going to be needed for any of this?
So we're still the category A and category B, like the debris and emergency response, those immediate, those can be covered at 100%. So no match for some of those things. And the governor is going to be getting a 30-day window that he hasn't selected yet. And we're going to try to place that 30-day window where any costs incurred related to the disaster would be at that 100% rate. Because we're still at the 75% rate for permanent work. So for the bulk of this expense, we're going to be looking at permanent work expenses. Right now, we're at the 75-25% rate. However, Irene was $217 million in public assistance money. All of our preliminary indicators are that we will exceed the amount of public assistance from Irene. After we cross $112 million, that's when the match can go from 75%, 75-25 down to 90-10. And at that point, I believe FEMA makes a recommendation to the president, and the president's the one who actually approves 90%. It's either FEMA headquarters or the president that approves it. But the one takeaway is that it's not automatic, but it is, I think, extremely likely once it crosses that 111. So I'm not a betting person, but I would bet that we're going to get the 90-10 somewhere around the end of the year after we've significantly crossed that 111 million obligated threshold.
So if I remember again, with the limited thing with Waterbury and also the state hospital, that there needs state dollars to be put out for the project to start, because FEMA comes in sort of after the fact. It's reimbursable. I mean, it's not FEMA dollars that get put out there first to do the construction. You have to have the state dollars there first to start the construction project.
Generally speaking, yes, Madam Chair. FEMA can do something called estimated projects, in some cases, like with the town of Johnson, we're exploring those alternatives to try to get Johnson funds faster from FEMA, because with the size of the project they're contemplating, it would be difficult for them to source that cash flow. For the state, it's usually better in the long run for us just to follow the reimbursement model with FEMA, because when you do estimated projects, they can sometimes lock you into certain paths that might not be the best path in the long run, or they can require additional work with FEMA and additional back and forth. So I do think going down the traditional route of reimbursement for a project of this size is probably the most likely outcome. So one caveat on that is that before we even get to the point of spending money, we line up all of those expenses with FEMA and we argue with them over, the cost for repairing each of the line items, the damage inventory, right? Then we have to estimate the cost of bringing the building up to state codes, right? And that's something we also have to negotiate with them. So we'll have the damage amount, and then we'll have the cost of code compliance on top of that. Then that calculation from a FEMA perspective has to be the most straight line version of mitigation that you can imagine. So my example here would be a portion of the parking lot is being reclaimed by the river. So one approach to mitigate that could be to construct a retaining wall against the river to protect the parking lot and stop that parking lot from continuing to fail. We may not want to do that, but in order to get reimbursement from FEMA, we need to cost out what it would cost to build that retaining wall. And then if we want to take an alternative approach using those same funds from that cost, then we have to propose an alternative project to FEMA. So I think it's very unlikely that the state of Vermont will want to do things in the most straight line manner as approved by FEMA. So I do think a number of elements of the Capitol Complex reconstruction will be in this alternate project where we cost out the most straight line FEMA way of doing it. And then we say, no, this is how Vermont thinks it should be done. And we want to take the money that you would otherwise approve for that and use it for this type of approach. That's probably, quite some time down the road. But I think
We won't know if they will allow that or not.
right.
And then if they don't allow that, and we decide to do the alternative, or a little more than what they have required, then it's all on our nickel.
It can be, yes. I think FEMA, it's a very, very large organization, of course, and it can depend on who's giving you the answers at that point in time. The current leadership of the public assistance team that's working with us is very enthusiastic, very helpful. So if that continues, I think it will help us with our efforts. And they're very willing to consider alternate projects and, do things in the way that ends up making the most sense and not just the traditional straight line calculation. Last time after Irene, we had a leadership change about a year and a half after Irene that was very problematic for the state. So it's just something we have to be on our guard with.
We have a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Doug, you mentioned codes. Generally speaking, how much of a difference is there between a federal and a state code, and which one's more stringent, sort of?
So the place where federal and state align the most closely, I would say, is in historic preservation, because the historic preservation designations at the state level are, designations into the Federal Register. And so that does have an effect, the historic preservation designation. But one thing that's very important is that our state floodplain management rule does not exclude historic buildings from flood mitigation requirements. It's slightly different if it's a historic building, but our rule passed back in 2014 or 2015 very clearly does not exclude those historic buildings. And that's unusual. Many states do not apply their own rules to themselves. They apply it to the public and then they kind of do what they want to do. But in Vermont, we do apply our rules to ourselves and hold ourselves to a higher standard. FEMA's not necessarily used to that. So that's an element we continue to reinforce with them, that our rule applies to our buildings as well. And we have a history. Joe mentioned the DMV project and the heat plant project. That history of showing, hey, we follow our rule and we enforce it on ourselves is helpful when it comes time to get FEMA to pay for some of the mitigation measures.
I think the pressures that you could feel moving forward would be to not to take the time and follow the roadmaps that other people are setting for you. because the worst thing that could happen is to feel the pressure that you need to get things right. You need to get things back in the way that you want them to be. And then, as the chair had mentioned before, get to the end of it and find that you have a lot more monies that the state could have gotten taken care of through the processes of insurance or FEMA, but you had jumped the train, and now you're on the hook for quite a few more millions that probably, had you followed the process, you wouldn't have been responsible for.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, that that's a risk. I think, especially when a project takes, more than 6 months, we all know this is going to take longer than 6 months. Especially with the potential impact to downtown businesses and, not having the state employees have as much presence. Some of that may be alleviated if BGS is able to maintain the temporary operational status. That may alleviate some of the pressure and give us more time to make sure we're coming to the right thoughtful decision, not just from a financial perspective, but, looking at how the complex fits into downtown Montpelier and how it should fit in there from a flood resilience perspective. We're expecting a lot of people to make hard choices, to protect themselves from flooding. And so again, we have to hold ourselves to that same standard. And that's sometimes painful.
And also and we don't know this, I'm assuming at this point, because it's so early. But thinking of our complex, thinking of FEMA and what has been required in the past for flood protection, be it 100-year protection, 500-year flood protection. If that starts to play in to our capital complex, we may be at a situation of really deciding what buildings are going to continue to be functional or not.
I think that's fair, Madam Chair. I think, for example, personally, I think it would be very, very, very difficult to walk away from like the Secretary of State's building. Like that is a very historic structure. It's a beautiful structure. That seems like something we would take a lot of strides to protect and retain. But other buildings that don't have as much historic significance, I do think it is a good question about how we approach those. And, I think anytime you're looking at this, it's also an opportunity. The water levels in downtown Montpelier, even if people stop using their basements, if we get another event of this size, there's still going to be damage to all of those structures, right?
As we saw in one of the buildings here, the one Green Mountain Care Board, they didn't have a basement.
Right.
So the water's going to go somewhere, it's going to go up. Those other buildings had the basement to take the water, and in some of the buildings, it did go up a little bit, it went up to the first floor, but the Green Mountain Care Board, the water had no place to go, and it ended up all in the occupied space.
Right. Yeah, I think that was partly due to where that building sits on the road and its elevation. But yes, I mean, it's.
Troy and then Wayne.
Do you have a best guess as to the impact this is going to have on insurance premiums going forward?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately for us, this did happen right as we were renegotiating our policy. It did result in an increase, but it wasn't a catastrophic increase. And the main reason for that is that Vermont has been, in insurance, you tend to pay a premium for what's happening everywhere else as well. So a lot of the wildfires in California, a lot of the national disaster risks have been pushing policies up and making them more expensive for a number of years. So it did result in an increase to our policy, but I don't remember it being a massive increase. But I do think flood insurance in general has been arcing to be very expensive and getting closer and closer to being prohibitive. Cybersecurity insurance right now it's almost impossible to buy a policy that buys you any amount of protection because cybersecurity is such a risk that all state and local governments face. Insurers are very hesitant to actually provide any protection there. I think, in Vermont, we feel very differently about our flood now than we did before the flood, right? Irene was viewed as more of a 100-year event. And now with this event coming only 10 years on its tail and really not coming from, it was raining for a long time and it didn't stop raining, but it wasn't like a hurricane or anything like that, right? So I think this one has really challenged our views of what we have to prepare for in Vermont. And I think some of that is also going to play into the actuarial industry, in that I wouldn't be surprised if flood insurance continues to become more and more expensive at a rate higher than inflation. I mean.
Wayne? And then Chip?
So as the rest of the community makes changes now, you mentioned the retaining wall, but some of the changes they make could in fact restrict the flow of water even more and cause problems if it's not coordinated. So it's, how is planning, is there going to be planning involved in trying to ensure that those kinds of things don't happen in the process of restoring or making things better? Because different people have different ideas and some of them are not good ideas.
I think, there's a wide array of opinions on how we need to address the rivers. And I would say one thing we really have working for us right now is that we have a strong team at the Agency of Natural Resources. I think it's something Vermont has always cared about. But when ARPA passed and there was, significant levels of investment, the legislature authorized a number of limited service positions there. So ANR right now has more staff and more capacity than they've had at any time in the past. It's temporary capacity funded by ARPA dollars, but it's there, right? And so I do think right now, and also with the bipartisan infrastructure law funding coming down, there was also additional funding in the water categories coming in. So it's never great to experience a cataclysmic flood. However, we do actually have resources in place to support those conversations right now that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we might not have had. So I think we need to have the watershed level, like not full watershed, but river corridor conversations, like Waterbury, Berlin, Montpelier, Barrie, that stretch. And ANR actually has the systems and the data to support these conversations as well, where you look at what different things being done to the river, what it will accomplish, and how it will affect the flood levels in various areas. I think Secretary Moore often talks about is often challenged on dredging, and the hydrological models that they have show that you can dredge, but then when you get an increased volume, it just makes the flooding that much more damaging because it pushes, once it exceeds those banks, it's then has much more violence and much more force. So dredging doesn't necessarily help alleviate damage.
In the staffing you're talking about, those limited term positions, a lot of those, so my understanding, were to move grant money through. So, the question is whether the staffing they have is in the right place, because what we're talking about is a higher level of staffing than what you'd have for those limited terms. If they're going to be looking at hydraulics and.
Yeah, I think that's true, that a lot of those staff are dealing with or supporting municipal programs and municipal water and wastewater systems. But some of those positions were, scientific or engineering positions that are supporting the science and the decisions behind those. And I have had a number of conversations with the river corridor section, and I think,
they felt they had capacity.
I think they're very capable of having those discussions.
Another question, Chip?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I represent Hardwick, and I'm looking at between Greensboro, Bend, and Hardwick, probably thousands of yards of gravel that has washed from our roads into the river, narrowing the river corridor, and it seems to me that displaces water and causes bank erosion that actually causes more flooding. I've been contacted by quite a few people actually right now to look into some sort of, 50 years ago, we used to harvest that gravel out of the rivers. It was called bank run gravel, and it was put back on the roads where it comes from. And so, I'm just confused, and I need to have some conversations with A&R, but just as a follow-up, it seems to me that the rivers actually being that much more shallow, even fish protection. I mean, trout like deeper, cooler pools of water. And when you don't have those deeper pools of water because there's so much gravel in the rivers, it's impacting your fish population as well, which I understand was the initial piece of that no dredging in the rivers or allowing rivers to flow. So I will be looking into it, I think, to see where we're going with it. It's really obvious around. I mean, Hardwick Motel, the governor was there, washed into the river for the second time. And just all of the river corridor, there's been acres and acres of land that has been lost by landowners as a result of this flood, and no compensation for that.
Right. I do think it's not a hard and fast no dredging rule. I do think it depends on the situation. And I know there's a situation in Jamaica where I believe they're considering whether or not it makes sense to remove sediment because it may make sense in that situation. I don't think it's a cure-all, but I do know that the Rivers team is looking at dozens of points of debris or sediment in the river and kind of evaluating each of those based on their circumstances.
The other piece that I was starting to ask about is FEMA. Does FEMA recognize the historic value of some of these buildings that were impacted by the flood? I mean, you've got to preserve your woodwork and various parts of these old buildings that are historic buildings. Is that recognized that we've got to be a little bit more observant as far as reconstructing those buildings?
They absolutely recognize historic preservation designations. Unfortunately, from my perspective, it almost works in a perverse manner where the baseline with FEMA is that substantial damage assessment. So if a building is more than 50% damaged, it's called substantially damaged. And at that point, flood mitigation efforts must be put in place going forward, right? So it's actually a good thing from my perspective if a building gets that classification, because then it's less to argue about. It's like it was substantially damaged, we need to mitigate it, we all want to do that, right? If it's a historically designated site, that substantial damage rule doesn't apply. And so then you have to look at the damage and our rule says flood mitigation still must be done on that site. In most other states, that's not even the case. So in many cases, historic structures face less standards as far as flood mitigation goes. And in talking to the historic preservation officer, she's definitely of the opinion that we should be protecting these historic buildings and we should be doing any mitigation we can that doesn't impact or degrade the historic nature of the building, but protects it from flooding. But the way that the regulations at FEMA work, their natural structure doesn't lead to that outcome. So we actually have to work harder if a building has a historic nature to get mitigation performed on it and to get that approved. Yeah, so adding a historic preservation to a building, if it's not designated right now, I would not recommend that because then it will actually be more difficult to get it mitigated.
Interesting. Thank you.
Welcome to the layers of FEMA. It only gets worse.
If you don't mind, I was going to maybe stray a little bit from the Capitol complex and just talk about the general flood response while we have you, Doug.
It's okay with the chair. Yeah.
And,
We can a little bit because I'm looking at time.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to go to lunch and then we come back at 1 again with Doug.
Okay. And first off, I want to say, really appreciate having you in this role. And being from Montpelier, I think you can, sympathize with the collective trauma, that everybody went through. If it rains, people get nervous these days.
Yeah.
And I don't want to reflect too much about what happened, but just to be candid with you, I felt a bit of a lack of state presence in the 2 weeks following the flood in town. You know, you had people in basements, like up to water, you know, you had people like pumping diesel out of their basements. And, you know, it felt like we needed people going door to door there to, you know, lay out health and safety protocols. You know, we need to go where they are. And didn't always see that. You know, we had the Red Cross, they were in Barrie one day. They were here the other day. We'd run out of water. You know, we'd have to like call businesses to see if we could get water for folks at the door. You know, just when the flood happened itself, it's people had suitcases by the door and it's like, do we leave? Do we not leave? So I'm just hoping like we think of these kinds of things as we look into the future. And, you know, as you talk to businesses, the 20 million was really appreciated and really necessary at the time. But like the average business in Montpelier is, as you know, $200,000 in the hole here, coming after the pandemic where they were already in the hole. So I think there's like a general anxiety in town, like, do we open or not? Like Wayne was saying, you know, is somebody with a bunch of fancy letters coming and saying, okay, this is the regional approach to flood mitigation, and you can open your business because we're doing everything we can to stop it, and we're communicating that clearly. I think, you know, it ended up being a very isolated and fragmented approach with Barrie, Montpelier, other municipalities, just because we don't have the capacity with a $15 million budget, you know, and City Hall underwater to address this. So I don't know if you're able to give a preview of sort of coming into this legislative session. Are there going to be, you know, more robust packages to help businesses, to make municipalities whole, to help like residences who fell through the cracks on this, because many of them did, and looking at the big mitigation plan and saying, you know, help is on the way, like we're going to be there for you?
So I'm limited in how much I can preview, but I'll talk about as much as I can right now. One thing I would acknowledge is that we have received the feedback that people on the ground didn't feel the state's presence during the first 2 weeks of the event as much. And one element of that is not quite intentional, but it's a side effect of the way that we structured our emergency management plan, is that the state works directly with the local emergency management directors. And those people felt like we were there and we were giving them what they needed. So we were behind the scenes with the local emergency management directors. But because in an emergency, sometimes we prioritize efficiency of communications over breadth and quality, we're working with that emergency management director, but the state's not necessarily connecting with the select board members or the town clerk or the town manager or the other people in the town that really need to know what's happening. We're relying on working through that emergency management director, which is efficient, but it's not holistic. And it doesn't really lead to much of a feeling of presence. So we're set up at the state to provide a supporting role, but I think it's fair to say that we weren't out there in the communities. We were providing communities with resources as they requested, checking in on a daily basis, trying to make sure, and there were communications snafus that happened. There always are during any event, unfortunately. And I think the question is that the right dynamic for Vermont? Do we want to maintain that type of approach? It's a little bit out of deference to local control, and that the state doesn't want to come in and take over for a town. We want to support the town and give them what they need to succeed. But I do think there were some very universal things like mold and health remediation and other things that are consistent with any disaster, and the state should have been pushing those out right off the bat. So yeah, I do think we are conducting after action reviews. It's actually, I guess it's already pretty much past the fall, but the Vermont Emergency Management is conducting after action reviews and trying to gather some of that feedback about where we can improve, where things didn't feel very good. I also think we need to be realistic about, when we have a disaster of this size hit, we have 9,000 state employees and we have 250 plus towns. And most of those employees aren't in any profession related to disaster response. So we're a small state with small capacity. And we need to be honest about what we can achieve, but we might need to achieve something different than what we did in the last disaster. As far as packages go, as far as assisting businesses, I know that the national framework for assisting businesses is very thin. FEMA doesn't help businesses really. The SBA process is very dissatisfying to me. Like the rate of businesses actually finding that process useful is very low. You see many more homeowners take small business association loans than businesses, which doesn't make much sense to me. It seems like the program might be designed incorrectly if that's the case, right? So I think there should be more conversations about what our business communities need to recover. For me, one of the biggest things I'm still wrapping my head around and trying to figure out what valuable proposals we can bring forward on is housing. I think, our housing, we need to do take dramatic measures as far as increasing the rate of unit production, increasing the ability to maintain existing stock. And I think that a lot of pressures that are on businesses and workers, if we can alleviate some of those housing problems, there's a lot of secondary benefits to increasing the housing stock. So rents can go down and people can actually find employees, have a place for employees to come live when they find people that are out of state. Whereas right now it's like, if you recruit someone from out of state, it's like, well, I'd love to have you work here, but good luck finding a place to live.
So Connor, I think your question about how is this going to affect the session and what we talk about, that's going to be the underlying issue. January, beginning of our new session, I think the flood issue and the recovery is going to suck the oxygen out of the room.
Well, I think another point it could be made on that as well is what Doug had said about the frequency of the storms that are coming in. Things are changing. And as you fix things, you evolve more. Government will evolve as it goes forth. And maybe the point that you made, Connor, is very well taken. That that's the place where we need to evolve better. We need to maybe have people in place that can go around quicker. And where other parts, Vermont is very protected from natural environment consequences. And if we're going to see more of them, well, then maybe we need to figure out how we can put more processes in place and more people in place to respond quicker, if that's what we need to respond to. If it's only once every 30 years, well, there's not much there. But if it's something that's going to be going on every 5 to 10 years, then maybe that's we have to change our processes as well.
I just say, I agree, municipalities are often protective over their turf. I think in the case of a natural disaster, it doesn't recognize those community borders. And unless you take a regional approach to it, you see inequities from community to community. I wonder if we didn't have Montpelier alive and that volunteer network, what would have become of us, And I worry about communities that didn't have that active volunteer network.
So I think that lays down some policy decisions and maybe the legislature will look at in terms of what you said, Doug. It's our emergency management level on the state level connects with the emergency one person in a community. And then the balance is, well, that's local control. But if you want to do it on a regional level, that's where we're going to have some conversations, I would assume, in our committees of government operations and really trying to balance that. So I'm going to move it along because we were going to break around 12:15. We've scheduled in a 45-minute lunch. So, and Doug is back to do a little deeper dive in this in terms of federal and state rules that are now in place that were not in place when we dealt with FEMA back in 2012, 13, and 14. So if we could come back at 1 o'clock, we could do that quickly. I'd appreciate it.
And if we could see the senators up here before we break for lunch, just for a quick minute, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. So we'll see you at 1 o'clock. Cafeteria is open. Or go for a walk.